In nuke news, another day, another ominous development in Fukushima. According to new numbers from the Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, the plant's operator, as many as 10% of that nuclear facility's containers may be leaking radioactive waste. And while the release of toxic chemicals into the environment is bad enough, this new problem comes with an added risk. It could cause a violent explosion. As one nuclear official told The Telegraph, since the leak was thought to be caused by a hydrogen buildup, quote, if the concentration level is high, a spark caused by static electricity could cause the container to explode. TEPCO, for its part, says there's no risk of an explosion right now, but the fact that we're still talking about what else could go wrong 4 years after Fukushima melted down is a story in and of itself. And with me now for more on all this is Paul Gunter, Director of the Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear. Paul, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
It's great to have you with us. So what's going on here?
Well, this is another development. We have the Advanced Liquid Processing System, it is called. This is what's filtering out all the radioactivity in these hundreds of tons every day of radioactive water that are washing over these melted reactor cores, and they're filtering out some of the radioactivity. This is creating sludge on the bottom of these tanks that is not only extremely radioactive, but it's also chemically reactive, and it's generating hydrogen gas. And now we find that some of these tanks in this so-called advanced system were never installed relief valves. Some of the relief valves on these tanks are not operating, and in fact we're now we're seeing evidence that some of these tanks have reached levels of hydrogen gas that would explode if exposed to a spark or a flame.
Shades of the Hindenburg at Fukushima.
And the big concern here is that, you know, we have a situation where if these tanks explode, it would also spread radioactivity in greater concentrations, likely denying bigger areas of the plant to where workers could actually get in there. And so, you know, shrouding this reactor site in more radioactivity, you know, it's amazing. We're still, you know, seeing an accident completely out of control 4 years after the initial explosions.
Right. And they are still leaking radiation into the Pacific Ocean, are they not?
Hundreds of tons a day. I mean, this is, we see about, on average, about 300 tons by their estimates, but clearly the groundwater movement is taking a toll that is both unpredictable and uncertain. And, you know, just a couple of days ago, the Tokyo Electric Power Company confirmed that radioactivity in the port area of Fukushima Daiichi is at the highest level of radioactive contamination that it's ever been at. So we continue to see the radioactivity levels in the Pacific Ocean there, right at the plant, escalating, and without really any prior precedent. This is an accident that's really out of control.
Japan sits at the junction of 4 major tectonic plates. It's why the area is so geologically volatile, and why the Japanese are so well prepared to deal with the threat. So what went wrong in 2011? The problems begin on March the 11th. Earthquake detection systems predict a huge tremor with a magnitude of 7.2. Warnings are sent out. Chris Alderson has lived in Japan for 13 years. He's come to expect such tremors as an everyday part of life.
Earthquakes are sufficiently common that people don't usually concern themselves with them overly. Some of them are so minor they barely even stir comment. Others, people will perk up their ears a little bit, point out the earthquake to their co-workers and get back to their work.
At 2:46 p.m. local time, the earthquake hits. With a magnitude of 9, it's 100 times more powerful than predicted.
You tend to expect them to fade away as usual. Instead, they sort of grew in strength and intensity to an extent that none of us had experienced before.
It's the largest known quake in Japanese history. One of the 5 most powerful ever recorded. The quake's epicenter is 65 kilometers off Japan's east coast, where a 300-kilometer section of the Earth's crust is pushed upwards by about 5 meters. It's a seismic event known as an undersea megathrust earthquake. The force of the shockwaves is so enormous, Japan moves 2.5 meters, and the axis of the entire planet shifts about 18 centimeters. Despite the magnitude of the quake, precautionary measures limit the damage.
There's a great deal of education among the Japanese population about how to behave during such disasters. So whilst there was concern, there wasn't the sort of terrified panic which one might suspect.
It appears technology has protected the Japanese. But the earthquake is just the first phase of a double disaster they had to face that day. Because the tremor has given birth to a tsunami, and it's heading towards Japan's northern coastline. Coastal engineer Alison Raby has been studying why the events of 2011 escalated into one of the worst disasters of its kind, placing it in the top 10.
We're going to simulate that megathrust type event using this hinged board down here. That's going to represent the edge of the crust that comes up in that type of rupture, and we're going to spring that plate up, and that's going to raise a huge body of water. 3, 2, 1.
In open water, the initial wave is relatively small, just 1 meter high. But as it approaches the shoreline and enters the shallows, it begins to slow and grow in height. All too aware earthquakes can cause huge waves, Japan has a sophisticated tsunami warning system.
In Japan, when there is a tsunami, warnings are automatically generated, which are heard on cell phones, brought onto television stations. Immediately, people were aware that something was going on.
Along Japan's northeast coastline, people begin to evacuate or take refuge in designated shelters.
Japan had one of the best defended coastlines in the whole world. And here we recreated certain parts of the Japanese coastline.
Raby and her team have reconstructed particular towns and their defences to examine how they coped when the tsunami hit.
We start here in the city of Kamaishi. Kamaishi was a deep water port, and it had the world's deepest breakwater. This was protecting the very large steel factory and a large population. Further south, we had the settlement of Minami Sanriku, and here we've recreated one of the vertical evacuation structures. This was clearly signed so that people who were on low ground could escape from the incoming wave. And then we move into the coastal plains. Now, these were protected by concrete revetments, and behind that, a pine forest, and those were all designed to protect the settlements behind.
The Japanese have taken a calculated risk. Their fortifications are only designed to cope with waves up to 12 meters high. But the tsunami surging towards them is a monster, peaking at 40 meters. To help the victims, Chris Alderson heads north to the flood zone.
We went from the humdrum day-to-day life in the big city to suddenly traveling through what appeared like a set from a science fiction post-Holocaust movie. To suddenly see these people torn from their homes, to see the scale of this destruction and death, where a boat is dropped in the middle of a village, or a large articulated truck is stranded on the roof of a factory. It was unworldly. It was very difficult to believe that this was a new reality.
The disaster gets even worse when a flooded reactor at the Fukushima Daiichi plant melts down.
Fukushima Daiichi is 250 kilometers northeast of Tokyo. The nuclear power plant has 6 reactors, each reactor successively commissioned during the 1970s. Units 1, 2, and 3 were operating at full power. The core in Unit 4 was unloaded. Units 5 and 6 were in cold shutdown. Fukushima reactors have a different technology than the pressurized water reactors built by the French operator EDF. They are boiling water reactors called BWRs. We say reactor because the heat in the core is produced by fission reactions. Boiling water because the water that removes the heat from the core turns into steam, and the steam goes directly to the turbine. The turbine drives the generator that produces electricity. Afterwards, the steam is condensed with the help of a seawater cooling system and returns to the core. A boiling water reactor has only one single system combining feed water and steam. The core is composed of fuel assemblies containing uranium. It is controlled by control rods introduced from the bottom that can stop the fission reactions in case of an emergency. Fission of uranium nuclei produces radioactive atoms that in turn produce heat, and this continues to occur even after reactor shutdown. This is called residual heat. Keeping the fuel confined and cooled is a major safety issue. The fuel is isolated from the environment by different containment barriers, just like the famous Russian dolls. A first barrier, the fuel cladding of zirconium alloy. A second barrier, the steel reactor vessel in combination with steam and water cooling systems. Finally, the third barrier, the containment building in concrete with a leak-tight steel liner. The fuel is kept under water in the reactor as well as in the adjacent pool where the spent fuel is unloaded. The pool is located at the top of the reactor vessel to facilitate the transfer of fuel underwater. When the earthquake hit the coast, seismic sensors triggered the insertion of control rods. Although fission reactions stopped, the residual heat had to be removed. The off-site power supply was lost, and the emergency diesel generators took over automatically. They supply electricity to the backup systems needed for core cooling. In reactors 2 and 3, it is a turbopump. The steam generated by the reactor operates the turbopump, which feeds water into the reactor vessel. The steam is condensed in the wet well suppression pool within the containment. In reactor 1, there was no turbopump, but a heat exchanger, which condensed steam from the reactor vessel. The condensed water was reintroduced into the reactor vessel by gravity. This heat exchanger provided core cooling by natural convection for more than 10 hours. Until then, everything seemed under control. However, reactor 1, due to excessive cooling, forced the operators to temporarily isolate the heat exchanger in compliance with operating procedures. The tsunami wave arrived less than an hour after the earthquake. The waves went over the seawall, flooding the lower parts of buildings and disabled the emergency diesel generators. On reactor 1, the operator was unable to reactivate the heat exchanger. The core was no longer cooled. It would be the first to melt. On units 2 and 3, the batteries were still operational. They operated some of the valves. The turbine-driven pumps ran for nearly 24 hours and then stopped. The cores were no longer cooled. The meltdown scenario is almost the same in all three reactors, only the dates change. The water in the reactor vessel evaporated. The fuel became uncovered. Heated up to a temperature of 2,300 degrees Celsius, the fuel melted and mixed with the materials from the structure to form a magma called corium. The corium flowed down to the bottom of the reactor vessel. According to Japanese officials, it pierced the reactor vessel before falling on the concrete basemat inside the containment. What quantity of corium fell? How deep did it erode the concrete? Did it pierce the steel liner? Even today, it is not possible to learn more about the state of the corium in the three reactors. At the same time, still in the reactor vessel, the steam was loaded with radioactive elements and hydrogen. To explain this phenomenon, let's have a look at the early stages of fuel degradation. Heated at high temperature, the fuel cladding is oxidized and cracks, releasing volatile radioactive elements. In addition to this, the zirconium of the fuel clad created a reaction with the steam by absorbing the oxygen and by releasing hydrogen. Normally, when mixed with air, hydrogen catches fire and explodes. However, the containment building was filled with nitrogen, an inert gas that avoids the presence of oxygen. At this stage, there was no risk. As the steam pressure rose to a dangerous level in the reactor vessel, the depressurizing valves opened. Gas was forced into the wet well suppression pool by a venting line. The water acted as an efficient filter by trapping much of the radioactive elements. But the water was no longer cooled because the emergency diesel generators were out of order, and it soon began to boil, thereby reducing its filtration capacity. The wet well suppression pool and the communicating containment began to enter into an overpressure situation. To avoid containment rupture, the operator decided to release the gas into the atmosphere. Normally, the venting line should have led all the gas outside the building by the chimney of the plant. But hydrogen was escaping through uncontrolled leakage pathways and was released into the reactor building. Hydrogen reacts violently with oxygen in the air. The explosion blew apart the frame at the top of the building, apparently without damaging the containment building. Radioactive elements not yet trapped in the wet well suppression pool were released into the environment. Due to the absence of usable fresh water on the site, the operators decided to inject seawater into the reactor vessel. This solution, far from ideal, since salt is chemically active, had at least the advantage of cooling and stabilizing the corium. In the 4 days following the tsunami, the 4 reactors were damaged by explosions, and 3 of them with core melt. Although it has kept its structure intact, Reactor 2 is the current source of the most important radioactive releases into the soil as well as into the sea. The explosion took place inside the building. Operators have probably encountered difficulties depressurizing the containment, and the wet well suppression pool broke. This loss of leak tightness led to the discharge into the atmosphere of unfiltered radioactive elements and to the spreading of highly contaminated water in the buildings, leading to highly polluting discharges into the sea. The explosion of Reactor 4 was due to hydrogen, even though the core was completely unloaded. The hydrogen came from Reactor 3 via a joint pipe. The reactor's storage pools were also a great concern because they had lost their cooling systems, and in addition to this, they were not protected by any containment. Very little spent fuel was stored in Pool 1. However, there was much more in Pools 2, 3, and 4, especially Pool 4, which contained the equivalent of the 3 cores. In all 3 pools, the water started to boil, and without the help in extremis of cold water from helicopters and from a fire hose, the spent fuel would have caused considerable radioactive release into the environment. Gradually, the situation began to stabilize. By the end of March 2011, fresh water had replaced seawater. In July, the reactor cooling system was again in operation in closed circuit, thereby avoiding discharges of contaminated water into the environment. In December 2011, Japanese authorities officially declared that the nuclear power plant reached the cold shutdown state, an expression used when the cooling water does not evaporate anymore and remains liquid below 100 degrees Celsius. This nuclear crisis was managed by men working under extremely difficult conditions, cut off from the rest of the world, with no news from their families after the tsunami, without any power supply, threatened by radiation. They fought with all their force to cool the reactors, trying to make, in vain, the backup systems work again, or by using improvised means. After this race against time to cool the plant, followed a year where about 20,000 workers succeeded each other, trying to regain control of the plant by, first, enhancing the dike against another tsunami, mapping the site contamination, clearing every access to the site, immobilizing radioactive dust, treating and disposing of contaminated water, and avoiding further radioactive release. In the years ahead, the challenge will be to remove the spent fuel from the pools for final storage in radioactive waste repositories. And then eventually, on the long term, under the critical eye of international experts, the issue will give way to a challenge, namely to remove the melted fuel from the 3 damaged reactors and to dismantle the site.
3 years after the meltdowns, the road to Fukushima is still a gauntlet of roadblocks and strict security checks. And inside the exclusion zone, it remains a post-apocalyptic landscape of abandoned towns, frozen in time. We were on our way to one of the most hazardous places on Earth, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, granted the NewsHour permission for a rare tour inside the plant, where 3 nuclear reactors melted down after the Great Tohoku earthquake and subsequent tsunami on March 11, 2011. In the seismically isolated and radioactively protected Emergency Response Center, we met the man in the hottest seat of all here, Superintendent Akira Ono. He runs an unprecedented decommissioning project that will not be done for decades. He prefers not to call it a cleanup. After all, if you're just cleaning up after an accident, he told me, there is a lack of quality, meaning speed is the only concern. I feel that isn't enough. We need to look ahead 30 to 40 years. To see it firsthand, we had to suit up.
All right. And then, scoop it out.
We must also wear a full face mask and respirator for good measure. Resembling astronauts on the way to a fully fueled rocket, we donned special shoes and hard hats, then boarded a bus that would get us as close to the meltdowns as the laws of physics and common sense would allow us. Fukushima Daiichi, or number 1, was a complex of 6 boiling water reactors designed by General Electric. They were built on sloping terrain, sandwiched between a mountain ridge and the Pacific Ocean. The nuclear cores are between 600 and 800 feet from the harbor. 3 of those cores are now melted down, still steaming hot, their steel containment structures breached. Engineers believe some of the nuclear fuel has melted right through the steel containment vessels onto a concrete basement floor, where it is exposed to groundwater.
As the groundwater passes through the plant, it gets mixed in with the contaminated water that is used to cool the melted down cores. The result is an awful lot of water that needs to be captured, or else it ends up in the ocean.
Each and every day, About 100,000 gallons of fresh groundwater seeps into the basements of the plant, where it becomes contaminated with a witch's brew of radionuclides. TEPCO is furiously trying to keep pace with the water. They finish a new 250,000-gallon holding tank here about every other day. But the hastily built tanks have been leaking, prompting a switch to a welded design, buttressed by gutters, dikes, trenches, and water sealing. Regardless, no one disputes the plant is steadily leaking radiation-tainted water into the sea. When you go out to the open ocean, there is very little contamination found, says Superintendent Ono. Basically, the contamination is limited to the port. At the port, they are bolstering the last line of defense. This water shielding wall should be complete in September. Behind it is a system that injects a chemical into the ground that turns water into a viscous gel, stemming the flow to the sea. The company is also testing an idea to bury cooling pipes near the melted reactors to freeze the ground, making impermeable ice plugs and walls that would keep the clean and contaminated water apart. But all of this is clearly not sustainable. In about 3 years, they will run out of space for new water holding tanks. Then what? Masayuki Ono, no relation to the superintendent, is general manager of TEPCO's nuclear power division. We can't solve this problem by simply increasing the number of tanks, he told me. We need to solve the fundamental issue of underground water coming in. And TEPCO is also investing a lot in this sophisticated radiation water filtering technology. In trial runs, the Advanced Liquid Processing System, ALPS, has cleaned up 12.5 million gallons of water. ALPS removes cesium, strontium, and 60 other radioactive nuclides, but not tritium. There is no practical way to filter out this isotope of hydrogen. It is hard to remove tritium with scientific methods, he says, but given its biological properties, it is a radioactive substance with a very limited risk. Nuclear engineer Lake Barrett worked for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission at 3 Mile Island in the wake of the meltdown there in 1979. He is now a special advisor to TEPCO's president.
When you combine all the water on the site with the tritium levels will be so low at Fukushima that they would meet the international drinking water standards.
TEPCO has no authorization from the Japanese government, local residents, or fishermen to discharge any water at all, including what is leaking from the Fukushima Daiichi site. But a release of millions of gallons of water tainted with tritium into the ocean seems inevitable.
You can release it into the ocean in a normal controlled release, which is what I personally believe they ought to do. But they have to work through the fishermen and all the governors and all the social issues that have to be addressed through that.
The long-term solution here is to remove and secure the nuclear fuel. At Unit 4, they have begun that process. This reactor was shut down for maintenance when the tsunami hit, and so the fuel had been moved into this storage pool. Even though the reactor was not running, during the worst of the crisis, hydrogen gas accumulated in the reactor buildings, causing a series of explosions. Debris rained down into the pool, landing on top of the stored fuel assemblies. Workers have now carefully plucked away the pieces and have begun removing the 1,533 fuel assemblies stored here. It's assumed that some debris fell through the gaps, engineer Takashi Hara told me. So far, we don't think it's anything that will cause the fuel to get stuck. However, it could be the case in the future, so we're proceeding very slowly. The fuel assemblies are transported in casks that will be stored in a more seismically secure common storage pool. If all goes as planned, this process will be complete by the end of this year. But removing the melted fuel from Units 1, 2, and 3 is another matter entirely. The radiation levels are simply too high for humans to ever get close enough to clean up. Even so, TEPCO is vowing to have the fuel debris removed from one of the reactors by mid-2020. But how? The only way to do that is to invent robots that can do the job. And that is precisely what they're trying to do.
They're probably the most robotic society, there is on Earth. Now you have to take it to another level, to work in the high radiation fields and to do things that they've never done before.
There are many things that will have to be done here that have never been done before in order to decommission this plant. We'll need to incorporate more and more new things, Superintendent Ono told me. You can't brood on the past for answers. I want to take on the various challenges with a constructive attitude.
Turn your hands over.
Before we left, they carefully scanned all of us and checked the dosimeters that we carried along the way. During our 4.5-hour tour, we absorbed as much radiation as we would have in a single chest X-ray. It was dark when we rode the bus out of the exclusion zone. It was a quiet ride, as we all processed the magnitude of the mess. 3 years after the meltdowns, the crisis has not ended here. In some ways, it's still unfolding.
What should TEPCO be doing? I think that it's a big concern right now that there really isn't any measured response. We don't know exactly what to do. TEPCO clearly has to open the country up to international aid. But Tom, the problem is that this accident is beyond any technology right now. TEPCO admitted that trying to get at that radioactive core in these 3 units that is melted down, that technology does not exist today and may not exist for hundreds of years.
Wow. So this is why we really shouldn't have nuclear power anywhere in the world right now, isn't it? I mean, it's a case study. And we have just a minute left. We've talked about this before, is the radiation from Fukushima now clearly showing up in the United States?
The radiation is moving in a plume down around the coast of Alaska, down British Columbia, and we're looking for signs of trace amounts of cesium-137, 134, especially the cesium-134. That's going to be the Fukushima signature, and we fully anticipate that it will turn up on the West Coast.
Wow, amazing stuff. Paul Gunter, it's always great to have you with us.
Thank you again, Tom.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Haul on this day was a good one, good at least for fishermen in Fukushima. Octopus is one of the few seafood items deemed safe enough to eat from these waters. For more than a year after the March 2011 earthquake and tsunami that destroyed the Fukushima nuclear plant here, fishing was not allowed at all. It finally resumed in June of 2012. But then in late July of this year, the plant was found to be pouring 75,000 gallons of radioactive water a day into the Pacific. It seems like we took one step forward, and as soon as things were getting brighter, the leakage put a damper on it, fisherman Hiroaki Adachi told us.
Before the earthquake, there used to be 400 fishermen in this association. Today, there are just 130. But the really surprising number is they used to haul in around 19,000 tons of fish a year. Today, they bring in just 300 tons. That's 2% of the catch.
With much of the fish still off limits, Hiroaki Adachi said he earns 10% of what he used to. To survive, he's relied on compensation payments from the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which owns the nuclear plant.
Would you eat what you're catching?
Now, after the announcement of the leaking, he told us, I have doubts that our fish is 100% safe to eat. But his fishermen's collective in this prefecture or county of Japan tests a sample of the fish that's caught for radioactive cesium and other contaminants. So far, in this type of octopus, none have been detected. Those test results are displayed along with the octopus at the local supermarket. Shopper Kazuko Matsui said she was confident enough to feed it to her grandchildren. I think it's safe to eat, and I want to get rid of the bad rumors, she told us. I'm local, so we should eat it to prove how safe it is. But the dangers are far more evident. Today, only 16 types of fish are considered safe to catch here, compared with 150 before the disaster. Seth Doan, CBS News, Fukushima, Japan.